Hello, and welcome back to the Talk Nats podcast. My name is Kevin Nibley, and we are sponsored by Old DC Apparel. Head on over to shopoldDC.com. Some of the coolest, most original DC fan shirts and hats you'll find. Also running a charity promotion for the 2026 Washington Post Layoff Fund. 100% of all of our charity shirts will go to that fund for the laid off Post employees. You can subscribe to us, as always, on YouTube at TalkNats Podcast. That's also our handle on X. And the audio version is available on every major podcast outlets. Speaking of the Post and the DC media landscape, we have a very special guest today. We are joined by the great Chuck Todd, a former host of Meet the Press, NBC News, chief political correspondent, all of that. We went on for a little bit, so I'm breaking this up into two parts. Today will be about everything that's happened in the DC sports media landscape, and a little bit of Chuck's backstory on how he went from a Dodgers fan to a Nats fan. So without any further ado, the great Chuck Todd. So right now, we are joined by a man who needs no introduction here in Washington, a giant in the world of media and politics, Chuck Todd. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here on the Talk Nats podcast.
Well, it's where else are we going to get information on the Nats but from you guys at Talk Nats? I mean, the go-to feed for my son and I.
So that leads into my first question. I do want to get into the Nats season and all that, but obviously a lot has happened in local media. The Washington Post shuttered its sports section. What's your take on that?
Look, I think it's I think it's a terrible business decision. Like, forget look, there's a lot of reasons to be upset sort of culturally and sort of sentimentally, but I don't want to talk about this the prism of nostalgia. Nostalgia is not a business plan, right? I totally understand that. It makes no sense financially. It makes no sense as a business here in Washington. The one thing, why the Washington Post wants to now be more like Politico and Punchbowl rather than the one thing that differentiated it, right? Which is it covered the community of the DMV in addition to being a top-notch national, congressional, and international news organization. And then so the different, in any business that you want to have a differentiator. Mm-hmm. And they have these differentiators. The sports section is a differentiator. Capital Weather Gang, I assume that's in trouble now because they don't cover local news anymore. And here's the other thing. This is a very intellectually wealthy market. What do I mean by that? I'm not saying everybody's got money, but everybody feels like they have to be well informed in order to operate in this community. Mm-hmm. Whether you work in government, work government adjacent, work in banking, work in, even if you work in something where you shower at the end of the day rather than at the beginning of the day, you've got to be conversant. Yeah. What does that mean? People will pay. So the inability to, hey, you want to monetize the sports section, then monetize it. All right. I mean, I wouldn't have been thrilled with that, but do it. But, the lack of, it's a reminder that somebody who is successful in business in one arena doesn't mean they know what they're doing in business generally. It just means they understood that one sector. And, that's what frustrates me is that it is just a bad business decision and bad management because literally the New York Times and the Washington Post were in the same situation. Yeah. One chose a path of broadening its offerings to create even larger potential subscriber base, and one is choosing to narrow its focus. And all you have to do is if you want to know what an expert thinks about what happens when a newspaper narrows its focus, you should just talk to Jeff Bezos circa 2013, who did an interview in front of the Washington Post staff when he was asked by Bob Woodward why he chose to buy the Washington Post. And I got to read you this quote directly because he makes the case that the Washington Post is now dead. Because here's what he said in 2013 when Bob Woodward, in front of the Washington Post newsroom, asked him a simple question. Why'd you buy the Post? Jeff Bezos answer then was, I finally concluded that I could provide runway, financial runway, because I don't think you can keep shrinking the business. You can be profitable and shrinking, and that's a survival strategy, but it ultimately leads to irrelevance at best, and at worst, it leads to extinction. And by the way, I could apply the same lesson to owning a baseball team. But I
Wow.
digress.
Okay. No. Cool. Okay.
How's
Well,
that
great.
for a transition for you there, brother?
You're setting up this interview like amazing. Amazingly, you're kind of hitting some questions I had. But okay. But sticking on the post, obviously there's a void in sports coverage now.
Right.
How do you see that ultimately getting filled?
Well, look, I'm a huge. I bow at the altar of politics abhors a vacuum is a great saying in politics. I think it's true of business. It's true of culture. There's a vacuum. Somebody's going to fill it. The question is who fills it? How's it filled? I've got some ideas. Other people have ideas. I'll tell you the three people who ought to be involved in filling this vacuum. It is Josh Harris, Ted Leonsis, and Mark Lerner. Because they're the three owners of the three biggest sport teams. I'll throw in let me toss Mark Ein into there, right? Mark Ein owns the tennis and some of and he's one of the investors in the Commanders. So I think Mark Ein really he shows up to a lot of political events. I know Mark a little bit, and he's a very familiar face to anybody in the sort of that part of the Washington community. I think he gives a darn, frankly, about the community. So, look, if fans don't know what those teams are up to, if fans don't have, don't know what's happening, well, that's fewer people that are going to find themselves interested in the sport, fewer people that may buy tickets, fewer people that may buy season tickets, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually in their interest to have a press corps that's covering them in order to drive interest and attention. Oh, by the way, all four of these gentlemen have arenas or amphitheaters or stadiums that they would like to have make money on outside of sports. And you need a local community organization letting people know what's happening in the community. So the point is that people aren't just going to follow the Nats or the Commanders or the Capitals or the Wizards to find out what's going on. They're going to want a third-party verifier. They're going to want this. So look, Josh Harris has been an investor in news organizations in the past. Ted Leonsis has a news organization. So I think, I'm sort of saying out loud what I would be doing right now. And I don't know if I'll have this opportunity, but I'd like to, which is, you could do DMV Sports right now, right? Go secure the thing. And my first people I'd look for investments from are those four gentlemen, because they have a vested interest. And you know what I would do? I'd remind Josh Harris, you wouldn't be the owner of the Washington Commanders if it wasn't for the Washington Post.
It's very true, very true. So do you think
so? It's going to happen. If I were in your shoes, I'd be thrilled. I mean, I say this, I am in it is my biggest career break was during the downturn on newspapers in the early 90s and the advent of the internet. And I was about your age. So this is an opportunity in destruction and disruption. There is opportunity for creation and for something new. And I think that'd be my focus. And I think between weather, culture, sports, we are one of the wealthiest communities in the country, and we are one of the intellectually curious communities in the country. There is plenty of room for a for-profit culture, sports, and local news organization. You just have to have a smart business strategy about it.
Yeah, no. So I was curious, do you think, obviously, where do you see print media going in the future? I mean, do you think this was an isolated incident with Bezos and the Post, or is this just going to be a problem for newspapers across the country moving forward?
Well, I just think that, look, the tough thing for the legacy newspapers are the legacy business contracts, right? You have union issues that sort of crush the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And, the barrier to entry, I think in some ways it is impossible, I think, for a legacy publication to reorient itself. It is easier to start from scratch in some of these cases. And that's where I think you're more likely to see. And look, is print dead? It depends on how you do print. It's clear that people are still reading books. And in fact, hardcover, everybody thought hardcovers were going to plummet. And we hit a plateau, right? The popularity of Substack indicates it hey, we kind of like reading.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it's sort of, you got to be efficient where it makes sense to be efficient with information. And then when you ask people to read something, you better deliver. So it's not that you just, I think the longer stuff has to be uber quality, and then the shorter stuff has to be super accurate and efficient. I think that's still, you know, do I think that there's room to create weeklies? I do. Like, I think there's some smaller local news operations who have started to add a print weekly, which is like, maybe it'll be a compendium of the local obituaries coupled with, and by the way, that's another thing that with the loss of local media is the loss of obituaries, which really are a glue for a community. It helps people. The greatest history lesson I have every single day is reading the New York Times obits. Because they always, it's always like some inventor of something that I've used my whole life, never knew who the person was. Kind of cool about them, right? But obituaries, but people, it's still the stuff people, it's very sticky. But obituaries, photographs, maybe, so it's not that print media is dead. I don't think reading's dead, and I don't think long form journalism is dead. I'll tell you, if you're looking for a model for what you guys are up to, I would, I don't know if you guys are familiar with a football Substack called, it's run by a bunch of guys who used to be sports writers at like the Green Bay Post-Gazette, Buffalo News. Oh God, is it?
I know the one in My wife's from
Go
Buffalo.
Long. It's called Go Long.
Yeah. No, I am familiar.
The Go Long Substack. Yeah. It's really good, and they do some incredible long form stuff still. Now it's not sporadic's the wrong word. It's on a schedule, but they don't overwhelm you. It's not like, oh God, the Atlantic sometimes overwhelms me. I'm like, all right, I some days I've just got to set aside 6 hours just for reading.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But Go Long has figured out how to be both a local sport, like they own the Steelers, the Packers, the Bills in ways that are and yet they're also broad and national too. It's they have found an interesting niche somewhere in between the athletic and local.
Cool. Now switching, I guess, back to baseball, the upcoming season. I assume you must be a Nats fan if you agreed to do this on some level. But
I am.
As anyone over 40, obviously, who's a Nats fan, probably began rooting for another team or has a baseball story. So for our audience, let us know kind of what's your baseball story. How did you get to where you are now?
Well, let me bring a certain gentleman. This is the origin story. All right.
Okay.
My origin story is Roy Campanella. And so here's how it goes. My father, who was born and raised in Waterloo, Iowa, was in Chicago as a kid with his family. They were in Chicago was like a 4 or 5 hour drive. So if you grew up in Iowa, you do that. They were going to Chicago for some reason, and they spent the night, and they apparently were staying at the same hotel that the Dodgers were staying at that happened to be in town. And this was before his accident and after his first MVP season, maybe, or second MVP season. He's a three-time I think he's a 3-time MVP guy, if I'm not mistaken, with Campanella. Anyway, my 5-year-old, this is legend in my dad's family. He's now deceased, but my 5-year-old father apparently sees Roy Campanella. And Roy Campanella was the face of Wheaties, because whoever won the baseball MVP got on a Wheaties box, right? And by the way, that meant an African-American on a Wheaties box. So that part of the story is never sort of like highlighted as some sort of, it just is sort of stated fact, right? So but I think people need to realize, how about that? Can you imagine going to the grocery store in 1952 and 53 and 54, and there's Roy Campanella. I'm guessing, unfortunately, those boxes weren't many of them, sadly. But my dad notices he's not eating Wheaties. So, my grandfather apparently goads him to go up to Mr. Campanella and ask him why he's not eating his Wheaties, right? And he's eating eggs, whatever it is. And he says, "Oh, I can't eat, I don't always eat it every day, whatever." So the Dodgers lose that day. They see Campanella the next day at breakfast. Campanella recognizes my dad and he says, "Today I'm going to eat my Wheaties." So, like anything with a little kid, when you're 5 or 6, right? You meet somebody like that, you're incredibly impressionable. So my dad was a Dodger fan for life. And so growing up in Miami, you want to talk about growing up without baseball. We grew up in Miami. We had no baseball.
Yeah.
And so my experiences with baseball were twofold. University of Miami college baseball, which was outstanding when I was a kid. And it was free after the third inning. And we were living on a pretty tight budget.
Okay. Yeah.
Which meant I always got there at the third inning. Now, later on, I was like, I was always like, hey, Dad, can we go to the beginning of the game? And later on, I found out why we always showed up at the third inning, right?
Sure,
it was like they let everybody in for free after the third. And then every spring break during school, we would drive to Vero Beach, which was the Dodgers' home for spring training back then. Now it's, of course, in Arizona. So I was a Dodger fan as a kid. Steve Garvey was my first favorite player. It was, yes, I'm aware of what in the 80s, he became a punchline for philandering.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, he was this myth. And, I copied his batting stance and, the Popeye arms. And I could still make an argument that he should be in the Hall of Fame, and he's being punished because by the time he came up for the Hall of Fame, it was during the steroids era before we knew steroids were inflating the numbers.
Yeah.
So his numbers didn't look as strong. And, and then his personal stuff, like had he been, but it's sort of like, if they're not going to put Garvey in, they're not putting Mattingly in. If they put Mattingly in, you probably have to put Garvey in. And we can all go through the Hall of the Very Good and blah 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 blah. I'm of the I go back and forth on it. So I was a Dodger fan, and my last memory, my dad, I have a father-son story. My dad's on his deathbed during the '88 World Series. And we're watching that in his hospital room. Now, we weren't together for the Gibson home run, but we were for the rest of the series. And so it's always been 88 has always been this, was sort of like, that was the final, and it was sort of there's a finality there. And then, fast forward, and I always wanted to live in a community with Major League Baseball. And when we got it, and then the Nats, and then I got a son, and he got into it. And then I'm out on the Dodgers. And I say it, I follow them still, but I sort of, like Kershaw's the last Dodger I rooted for.
Sure. Okay.
And it was like, it's the last Dodger jersey I purchased. It's the last, and like, that's it. I am Nats through and through. In fact, my son and I, we were on pins and needles about Max's decision, because the thing I've promised him, I've never been to Cooperstown. And we are going, I said that when the second he retires, we're going to make the reservation 5 years in advance, and we're going.
Yeah.
And I've been waiting and I was a little disappointed in some ways. If the Blue Jays had won the World Series, I think Max would have walked, right? If he had been the winner of Game 7.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Don't you walk?
So. Yeah, probably.
And so now he's going to pull a Clemens, and, obviously we'll get signed sometime in, May, June or July, which I get it. Yeah, he's not ready to give it up. And he, he's like, I pitched in Game 7 and I pitched well. I'm not ready to retire. Right? We know how the brain
his competitive motor is off the charts. So I feel like, maybe he'll even go 3 or 4 more years. I think he's probably going to go as long as he possibly can. Yeah. All right. So I think that's our episode. Some really cool stuff. I didn't know the University of Miami let folks in after the third inning for free. That's quite the deal. And, some really good opinions on the DC media landscape and where we go from here. As always, subscribe to us, YouTube or your audio podcast platform of choice. Visit Shop Old DC. Definitely check out that charity shirt to help support the laid off Washington Post workers. And go to talknats.com. As we mentioned, it's one of the last bastions of Washington baseball coverage. We'll be back at you with Chuck next week. We'll get into what he's looking forward to in the 2026 baseball season. And until then, go Nats.